The Archive of Salt and Static Prologue. In the delta town of Haishan, people said the world was made of two things, water and noise, and that anyone who learned to bargain with both could live. But Lian Wu discovered a third substance the day her daughter arrived. Silence, heavy as wet cloth and just as hard to wring out. Part-eye silence. The county clinic's ceiling fan clicked with every rotation, a tired metronome keeping time with Lian's contractions. And when Mika finally slid into the nurse's hands, Lian waited for the sound that was supposed to anchor reality, the sharp infant wail that tells everyone the lungs have opened for business. The cry came, thin and brief, and then the room settled into ordinary clatter-metal trays. Hurried footsteps, a doctor's cough, yet Micah's eyes remained unfocused, as if the noises were rain falling on the other side of a closed window. The nurse tested again and again, clapping beside each ear, snapping her fingers, striking a steel bowl with a spoon, and the baby did not startle, did not blink, did not turn toward the commotion, only rooted for milk with the stubborn purpose of a small animal. Grandmother Kwan arrived before sunset with a basket of eggs and a face that already carried disappointment like a familiar scarf. And the first thing she asked was not whether Lian was bleeding or feverish, but whether the newborn was a boy. When Lian answered, "Girl," Grandmother Kwan exhaled through her nose and said, loud enough for the other families on the ward to hear, that a first child should have been a son, because sons keep names alive and names keep ghosts fed. Jay, Lian's husband, stood at the foot of the bed in his mill uniform and stared at the floor tiles as if they had suddenly become complicated. He said nothing, and his silence felt like permission. Back in the village, the men congratulated Jay on becoming a father, and the women praised Micah's delicate brows. But every compliment came with a blade hidden inside. Pity for the girl, instruction for the mother, entitlement for the grandmother. During New Year, firecrackers tore the sky open in long strings of pops, toddlers shrieked and covered their ears, and Mika watched the paper ash drift down without flinching, her gaze calm as a pond that hasn't learned about stones. Lian performed her own tests with the desperation of a person conducting science in secret. She banged pots, shook a tin of coins, slammed the door, hummed beside Micah's cradle, then whispered the baby's name and waited for the smallest sign. Nothing. Even when a motorbike backfired right outside their doorway, Mika's hands did not twitch, and Grandmother Kwan nodded as if the universe had finally provided evidence for a decision she had been rehearsing for months. "Leo, a child born like this is a drain," Grandmother Kwan declared at breakfast, while Jay ate without looking up, and she used the word born, the way people use the word cursed, when they still feared old gods. She spoke of policies and paperwork, of disability certificates that would allow them to try again without the mill punishing Jay for exceeding birth limits, and she spoke of leaving Mika with distant relatives, as if children were sacks of rice you could move to protect your own harvest. Lian argued that a certificate would be a brand on the child's entire life, and that Mika might still be able to hear something if they saved for a device, if they traveled to the city for proper tests, if they treated the condition as a challenge instead of a verdict. Jay's answer was a tired shrug and a phrase that tasted like ash. "My mother manages the money. Don't stir trouble." Lian realized then that she was not married to a man, but to a household, and the household had already chosen its priorities. The first month after birth, when Lian's body still ached and her milk came in thin, unreliable waves, she was pulled into the fields before dawn to transplant seedlings with numb fingers. Grandmother Kwan locked the kitchen whenever Lian argued, then told neighbors Lian had no milk because she must have squandered her strength in some past life, a cruel superstition delivered as gossip. Lian drank bowl after bowl of hot water to trick her body into producing more, and Mika cried until her throat turned raw, the only sound the child made with confidence. When Lian asked Jay to leave a little of his wages so she could buy formula, he warned that his mother counted every coin, and that if she suspected disobedience, she would create a storm loud enough to reach the mill offices. "Let the girl drink rice water," he said one night, annoyed by the crying because it disturbed his sleep, and the casual cruelty of the suggestion told Lian he did not see Mika as a person with a future, only as a complication in his present. Lian began to gather money in ways the household could not easily seize. She foraged honeysuckle and plantain from the hills, dried them on old newspaper, and sold them to a medicine stall in the market. She repaired radios for shopkeepers, because as a teenager she had learned to solder wires from her father, who fixed fishing equipment. She hid her coins inside an empty tea tin buried beneath the hearthstones, and she counted them at night by the weak light of the stove like a gambler learning how long it takes to buy escape. Grandmother Kwan noticed the change in Lian's posture. the way she guarded her small freedoms, and responded with threats that sounded like tradition. She claimed that if Leanne could not give the family a son, the family could still start over by removing the useless girl. She repeated the line as a refrain whenever neighbors visited, so that the community would grow accustomed to the idea and treat it as inevitable, and Leanne learned that the most dangerous violence is the kind people begin to call normal. The attempt came on a market day when Leanne had been hired to carry fertilizer sacks for a merchant, and returned home sweaty and exhausted, only to find the courtyard too quiet. A child pointed toward Stoneback Hill, where fishermen left shells to listen for safe tides at a small shrine, and Leanne ran, stumbling on roots, her heart pounding so hard she felt it in her teeth. She found Mika tied upright to a pine trunk with a rope that bit into the child's wrists, and Grandmother Kwan stood nearby muttering prayers like an actor delivering lines. Leanne tore at the rope until her fingers bled, lifted Mika against her chest, and felt the child's small body shiver with fear that had nowhere to travel except inward. When the old woman stepped forward, calm and righteous, Leanne's restraint broke. She grabbed Grandmother Kwan's sleeve and dragged her down the path, screaming for the village secretary and the women's committee. People spilled from courtyards to watch, and Grandmother Kwan tried to weaponize their gaze by shouting that she was saving the family from shame. Leanne did not negotiate. She held a kitchen knife in one shaking hand and kept the other arm locked around Micah's waist, and she told the crowd that if her daughter disappeared, she would not disappear quietly. In that moment, the village saw what it rarely acknowledged. A gentle woman with nothing left to lose becomes more frightening than a powerful family with reputation to protect. The secretary, embarrassed by the spectacle and wary of legal trouble, ordered Grandmother Kwan to untie the child and warned Jay that the mill would not tolerate a scandal tied to policy violations. Jay arrived late and angry, not at his mother but at the disorder, and he scolded Leanne for humiliating the family in public. That night he kicked Leanne in the ribs during an argument, and when Leanne tried to defend herself, the in-laws pinned her arms while Grandmother Kwan slapped her face and called her ungrateful. Mika's frightened crying filled the room like smoke, and Grandmother Kwan, in a burst of rage, squeezed the child's throat until the sound thinned to a rasp. Leanne ripped free with an animal strength and fled into the night with her daughter. At the river bend, moonlight turned the water into a blade, and Leanne stood on the edge holding Mika, imagining a leap that would end the struggle in one cold sentence. Mika touched Leanne's lips with damp fingers, exploring the movement of breath and speech, and the small curiosity anchored Leanne more securely than any prayer. Leanne slapped her own cheek, whispering, "We live," because she needed words to become a command, then walked to an abandoned surveyor's hut, where the roof sagged and the floor smelled of old mud. The first storm found every hole in the hut, and rain poured onto Leanne's blankets until the straw mattress collapsed with a wet crack. But Leanne did not return to the Kwan courtyard. She patched the roof with scavenged palm leaves, built a small stove from bricks, and learned to sleep in pieces, waking at every rustle because the hut attracted snakes, stray dogs, and men who mistook loneliness for invitation. The village expected her to crawl back within 3 days, and when she didn't, the expectation curdled into fascination and anger. Part 2. Static. Leanne's first allies were not heroes but ordinary women who had been taught to endure, and who recognized in her refusal a small crack in the wall that trapped them all. Auntie Sue, who sold steamed buns at dawn, slipped Leanne a sack of stale flour and muttered that a child's life was not a bargaining chip, then looked away quickly as if compassion were contraband. The clinic nurse, embarrassed by her earlier impatience, wrote down the address of a provincial hospital on a scrap of paper and told Leanne to ask for an audiogram, a word that sounded to Leanne like the name of a distant city. Grandmother Kwan responded to Leanne's independence by trying to make the hut unlivable. She complained to the land office that Leanne was squatting illegally, told the river patrol Leanne must be a thief, and whispered to local men that a divorced woman was available if they were bold enough. The bold ones arrived at dusk, tapping on the door with the easy entitlement of people who had never been punished for their greed. Leanne learned to keep her knife visible, to speak in a low, steady tone, and to use a poker to pin a hand against the doorframe when someone tried to force the latch. One man offered marriage in exchange for protection and leaned close enough that Leanne smelled rice liquor on his breath, and she replied that she would rather sleep with a snake than share a bed with a predator. Another offered money and promised to take the mute girl somewhere, the phrasing casual as sweeping dust, and Leanne threw a ladle of boiling water onto the ground at his feet so he could imagine it on his skin. The visits grew less frequent when word spread that Leanne did not cry in corners. She fought like a person defending the only territory she truly owned, her child. Aunt Try, the matchmaker, showed up with red envelopes and practiced smiles, insisting that Leanne needed a new husband for respectability. And she listed candidates like livestock: a widower with a toddler son, a tractor driver with a small house, a fisherman with strong hands. Leanne listened politely, then asked the only question that mattered. "Will he help me get my daughter examined and fitted with a device?" Aunt Tri's smile wobbled because the question exposed the town's quiet cruelty, and she answered with a sigh that no man would pay for another man's child. Leanne nodded and said, "Then no man is worth my cooking," and shut the door. Work became Leanne's engine. She weeded fields for pay, cleaned the township office after hours, and repaired radios and cassette players for shopkeepers, because circuitry was honest in a way people were not. She recorded everything on tape. Grandmother Kwan's threats shouted across the lane, Jay's arguments, the dates and times of harassment, the names of men who arrived at her door. Sound, Leanne believed, was a kind of evidence that could outlast gossip, and she stored the cassettes in tea tins under the hearthstones, where damp could not reach them. Mika grew into a quiet child who learned the world through eyes and fingertips. She watched mouths and brows the way other children watched birds, and she sensed moods by the shape of a person's shoulders. Leanne taught her simple gestures: eat, drink, sleep, danger, then expanded into games that doubled as training. Leanne would exaggerate words, slow her speech, and have Micah point to objects as Leanne named them, building a bridge of meaning one plank at a time. Some villagers called it pointless, but Leanne saw Mika's focus and understood that silence can hide intelligence the way fog hides a ship. When the township secretary assigned Leanne a narrow strip of land near the levee as payment for community labor, it felt like a door opening a fraction. Leanne treated the soil like a savings account. She composted, rotated crops, and kept notes in the margins of discarded mill calendars, writing yields like a scientist tracking hope. She planted oilseed for cash and peanuts for protein, and she timed the harvest with the precision of a gambler counting cards. At night, she walked the levee with a lantern to check the sluice, because she knew sabotage often comes wearing the mask of weather. The first sabotage came anyway. After a windy night, Leanne found the sluice she had opened sealed with mud and stones, and an extra channel cut to feed river water into her plot until seedlings lay flattened like drowned hair. Grandmother Kwan stood nearby with a cane, smiling as if she had simply guessed correctly about fate. Jay arrived behind his mother, claiming coincidence, telling the onlookers Leanne was unstable, and that divorced women imagine enemies. Leanne did not swing her hoe at them. Though rage pulsed in her wrists, she knelt, felt the soaked soil, and decided that the best revenge was not a scene but a record. She repaired the field slowly, working under the sun until her neck burned. And when people asked why she didn't report the sabotage, she answered that reporting without proof is like shouting into the river. Then she started gathering proof. She offered to fix the township clerk's radio in exchange for access to the public notice board, copying announcements and learning which projects were planned and where. She volunteered at the clinic to wash bedding, listening to nurses complain about shortages that made no sense, and she noticed that the mill's blankets kept disappearing in bulk, not in stray pieces. Jay had always claimed poverty was a law of nature, yet his mother's cupboard held new quilts, his uncle's cousin suddenly owned a motorbike, and Jay's pockets carried small luxury cigarettes from the city, imported candy that did not match his salary. Leanne remembered how he guarded the mill gate and how trucks entered after midnight on certain nights, and she began to suspect that the household's cruelty was financed by theft. A suspicion is a seed. With enough water it becomes a tree, and Leanne watered hers with careful attention. One evening, Leanne left a broken tape recorder visible on her table, as if she had been careless, and she told Auntie Sue loudly enough for passing ears that she had materials she might send to the county. That night, a shadow approached the hut, and a hand worked at the latch. Leanne watched through a crack as Grandmother Kwan tried to pry the door with a kitchen knife, muttering curses. Leanne recorded the metal scrape, the whispered threat, and the moment the old woman gave up and spat on the ground. And Leanne smiled grimly because the tape would not forget. Another tape captured Jay himself. He arrived drunk after payday, demanding that Leanne return to the courtyard and stop embarrassing him, and when Leanne refused, he shouted that she was nothing without his name, that the village would grind her down, and that Mika's condition proved Leanne had bad blood. He also bragged, in the sloppy pride of intoxication, that a few quilts and rolls of cloth won't be missed, and that his mother deserved comfort for raising him. Leanne kept her face blank and her recorder hidden, and in the morning she wrote the date on the cassette case in neat block letters. As summer thickened, The harassment shifted from men at the door to whispered pressure from concerned elders. They told Leanne she should reconcile because a child needs a father. They said she was selfish for refusing another chance, and they warned that a lone woman brings disorder to a village. Leanne answered with kindness sharpened into a blade. She asked each speaker whether they would give their own wages to pay for Mika's hospital visit. And when they looked away, she said softly that advice without sacrifice is merely noise. A teacher named Miss Wren, newly assigned to the village school, visited Leanne one afternoon with a stack of workbooks and an apologetic expression. She said Micah was old enough to sit in class, even if she couldn't hear, because the mind does not require permission from the ears. Leanne walked Mika to the classroom the next day, and the children stared as if Mika had arrived from the moon. But Miss Wren placed Mika in the front row and used chalk drawings, hand signs, and exaggerated mouth shapes until Micah could follow basic lessons. For the first time, Leanne saw her daughter's pride become visible. A straightened back, a steady gaze, a pencil held like a tool. Part 3 Signal. Leanne's canola was her second gamble. The old coastal listening station, a wartime relic of concrete corridors and rusted bolts, sat near a patch of ground no one used, and Leanne assumed it was idle because no one had shouted at her yet. In villages, shouting often substitutes for paperwork. She planted canola in rows so tidy that passers-by paused to admire the geometry, and as yellow flowers opened like small suns, Leanne calculated that one harvest could finally buy a hearing aid. The thought kept her working even when her shoulders ached and her palms cracked. The demolition notice arrived, taped to a pole, written in bureaucratic language that pretended not to see human lives. The county planned to expand the clinic and needed the land, and the contractor's machines would begin clearing within days. Leanne read the notice 3 times, heart-dropping each time, because the words did not care about her spreadsheets of hope. She ran to the field and begged the project manager for 10 days, explaining that the seeds had not hardened and harvesting early would leave her with almost nothing. The manager shrugged and told her to file a complaint if she had a problem, then looked past her as if she were smoke. On the morning the bulldozer arrived, the air smelled of diesel and crushed weeds. Leanne stood in front of the machine, palms up, shouting at the driver to stop, while the crowd gathered in the casual hunger of spectators. Grandmother Kwan watched from the edge with a small, satisfied smile, as if the government itself had joined her argument about fate. The bulldozer's engine roared, the blade crept forward, and Leanne felt a panic so sharp it tasted metallic. She dropped to her knees and pulled Mika close, not to surrender, but to shield the child from a future that kept trying to erase her. Micah stepped out of Leanne's arms and planted herself between her mother and the machine, a tiny figure in a faded shirt, hands trembling but feet stubborn. Leanne yanked her back, terrified, mouthing, "Move," with desperate exaggeration, and Mika shook her head as if the gesture itself were an oath. The driver revved the engine, and the ground vibrated. The vibration reached Mika's bones, even if sound did not reach her ears. Micah's mouth opened, jaw quivering with effort, and a rough syllable escaped, more breath than word followed by another, and then the phrase, broken but unmistakable. "Don't. Crush." "Mom." Leanne froze, then sobbed so hard her ribs hurt, because the sentence was not only a plea to the driver but a door cracking open in her daughter. The crowd went quiet, uneasy at being witnesses to something intimate, and the project manager, suddenly aware of optics, barked for the bulldozer to stop. Leanne hugged Mika and repeated the phrase back to her, shaping each word slowly so Mika could see it. And Mika watched her mother's lips with a fierce concentration that made the moment feel like a ceremony. The manager offered one day to harvest what she could, a compromise born of embarrassment, and Leanne accepted because pride does not buy devices. Leanne harvested like a storm. She called Auntie Sue and Miss Wren, paid teenagers in sweet potatoes, borrowed sickles from neighbors who pretended not to support her, and worked through the night with lanterns. Canola seeds rattled into cloth sacks like hard rain, and Leanne's hands bled where the stems scraped, but she kept going because every gram was a coin in disguise. When dawn arrived, the field looked bruised and ragged, yet the sacks were heavy enough to make Leanne's arms shake, and she smiled through exhaustion because the future had weight. 2 weeks later, a county newspaper printed a short piece about a single mother resisting demolition, and the article mentioned both the listening station and the textile mill, which was a mistake in the way a loose thread is a mistake. A retired engineer named Director Venn, who had once worked on coastal acoustics and now chaired a charity committee, read the article and drove to Haishan in a sedan older than his patients. He visited Leanne's hut, listened to her tapes with the focus of someone who believed reality should match documentation, and asked quiet questions until the story became not only tragedy but a case. Leanne played him the tape of Grandmother Kwan prying the door and the tape of Jay bragging about missing quilts, and Director Ven's eyebrows rose in the precise way engineers express anger. He said that sound recordings could be admissible if authenticated, and that the mill's audit would take complaints more seriously if the complaint came from someone with his name. Leanne did not trust miracles, but she trusted mechanisms, and Director Ven was offering a mechanism. She handed him copies of her notes and tapes, keeping originals hidden because survival had taught her redundancy. While Director Ven made calls, the mill's internal audit, usually a sleepy ritual, suddenly became sharp. Jay was summoned to the security office and questioned about discrepancies. He denied until a manager placed surveillance stills on the table, showing a cart leaving the warehouse after midnight, and denial became sweat. When they played Leanne's tape of his drunken bragging, his face twisted with a panic he could not disguise, and he snapped that everyone did it and that his mother deserved comfort. The manager answered that theft at that scale was not a village rumor. It was a crime, and the mill was tired of paying for one man's household pride. Jay was detained, and the Kwan courtyard erupted in wailing. Grandmother Kwan ran through the village screaming that Leanne had destroyed her son, and she beat her cane against gates as if she could knock guilt loose. People who had once praised Jay's state job now crossed the street to avoid being associated with him, because reputation is a currency that loses value overnight. Grandmother Kwan came to Leanne's hut to demand forgiveness and money in the same breath, insisting that Leanne owed the family gratitude for having taken her in years ago. Leanne stared at her and said, evenly, that shelter is not a gift when it comes with a rope. The mill offered a settlement. Repay the value of the stolen goods or face prosecution. The amount was more money than the Kwan family could imagine, and Grandmother Kwan tried to raise it by canceling Jay's planned marriage to a younger woman and clawing back the engagement gifts. The younger woman's family refused to return everything. A fight broke out, and teeth were lost on both sides. By the time the money was gathered through selling furniture and leasing land, the Kwan household had been stripped down to bare walls and bitterness. Jay walked out of detention thinner and quieter, his uniform gone, his authority reduced to a shadow. Part 4 Resonance. Leanne took the canola money and Director Ven's committee assistance and traveled with Mika to the provincial hospital, a place where hallways buzzed with fluorescent light and announcements echoed through speakers. Micah disliked the echo, not because she heard it clearly, but because it vibrated unpredictably, and she clung to Leanne's sleeve while strangers looked at her face as if they could read her silence like a chart. The audiologist conducted tests with tiny headphones and calm gestures, watching not for hearing but for response. A blink, a shoulder twitch, a shift of gaze toward a tone. The diagnosis was precise. Partial sensorineural loss with residual low-frequency awareness, meaning Micah lived in a world of distant thunder but not of speech. The hearing aid arrived in a small beige case that looked too ordinary for how much life it contained. Leanne's hands trembled as she fitted it behind Micah's ear, and Micah flinched, eyes widening at a sudden invasion of sensation. The first sound Micah noticed was not a voice but the rustle of Leanne's jacket, amplified into something startling, and she pressed her palms to her ears as if the world had become too close. Leanne breathed slowly, mouthed reassurance, and guided Mika through the shock the way you guide someone stepping from darkness into sun. Gradually, with patience and water, with breaks for tears. They stayed in the city for weeks because fitting devices is not a single act but a conversation between body and machine. Leanne cleaned floors at a noodle shop at night to pay for the rental room, then spent mornings in therapy sessions where a speech coach taught Micah to pair mouth shapes with vibrations, to feel words as much as hear them. Micah practiced in front of a mirror, touching her throat to understand where sound lives, and every new syllable was celebrated like a holiday. When Micah managed to say "Mom" clearly for the first time, Leanne laughed and cried at once, because the sound was both familiar and brand new, like hearing your own name in a different language. Returning to Haishan with the hearing aid felt like carrying a lantern into a place that preferred shadows. Some villagers were kind, asking Mika to repeat words with gentle smiles, while others mocked, accusing Leanne of wasting money that should have gone to a real future. Grandmother Kwan, whose pride had been scorched by Jay's disgrace, arrived at Leanne's hut with swollen eyes and a face that tried to manufacture humility. She begged Leanne to reconcile, claiming Jay had learned his lesson and that now they could have another baby, perhaps a son, because without the mill job they were no longer constrained by policy. Leanne listened, then said she would not gamble a second child on a household that had already tried to erase the first. Jay came later, attempting charm as if charm could rewrite bruises. He said he missed his family, that Leanne had always been strong, that they could start over in the hut and build a better house. And he spoke of sons the way gamblers speak of winnings. Mika watched him with new attention now that speech sounds had edges, and when Jay raised his voice, Mika's shoulders tightened, remembering danger even before she could name it. Leanne saw the reaction and understood something she had been too tired to articulate. The opposite of love is not hate, but the willingness to expose your child to fear for the sake of social convenience. She told Jay that if he wanted to atone, he could atone from a distance. Miss Wren helped Mika integrate at school with practical creativity. She seated Mika where she could see faces, taught classmates simple signs, and turned cruelty into homework by assigning a lesson on kindness. Some children learned. Others remained cruel because cruelty is a language passed down. When a boy mimicked Mika's halting speech, Mika did not cry. She walked to the chalkboard and wrote the boy's name in careful strokes, then wrote "listen" beneath it, not as an insult, but as instruction. The teacher saw it and smiled, and Leanne felt a pride that did not depend on anyone's approval. Director Ven's museum idea emerged from practicality. The county preserved one concrete room from the old listening station as a token heritage site, and Ven asked Leanne to curate a small exhibit about sound and survival because he believed stories change faster when they are attached to facts. Leanne agreed on one condition, that the exhibit include not only boats and war history, but also the voices of women who had been told their suffering was normal. She recorded Auntie Sue's bunstall laughter, Miss Wren's chalk on board, the river's hiss against reeds, and Micah reading a short poem into the microphone with careful measured syllables. The tapes became a new archive, no longer evidence against a family, but evidence for a life. The Quan courtyard did not recover. Leasing land to repay restitution left them dependent on day labor, and Grandmother Quan's cane grew heavier as her anger shifted into fatigue. Jay worked construction, his hands finally learning the honest ache of carrying bricks, and when he passed Leanne on the road, he looked away as if eye contact were a debt. Sometimes Leanne felt a flicker of pity, not for him, but for the way a household's hunger for sons had eaten its own future, chewing through money, love, and dignity until only bone remained. One winter evening, Grandmother Quan visited the hut alone and asked, in a voice that had lost its vinegar, whether Mika could truly hear now. Micah sat by the stove, warming her hands, and answered with slow, clear speech that she could hear, "Some," and that "some" is enough to learn. The old woman's eyes filled, and she whispered that she had been raised in a world where women survived by obeying elders and producing sons, and she had mistaken survival tactics for moral law. Leanne did not forgive on command, but she allowed the moment to exist, because she had learned that healing is not a single clean act. It is the accumulation of small decisions not to poison the future. Interlude: the attempted taking. After the hearing aid arrived, the danger did not vanish. It merely changed its costume. Jay began to appear at school gates and market corners with a rehearsed smile, telling people he only wanted to see his daughter, and the village, trained to excuse fathers, nodded as if his interest were a virtue rather than a strategy. One afternoon, while Leanne was at the township office scrubbing floors, Jay waited near the classroom and coaxed Mika with candy from the city, waving his hand to signal, "Come," the way he had seen Miss Wren do. Micah recognized the shape of his impatience, hesitated, and then stepped back toward the door, and that hesitation saved her. Jay grabbed Mika's wrist anyway, not hard enough to leave marks for witnesses, but hard enough to communicate ownership, and he dragged her toward a motorbike where Grandmother Quan stood with a cloth bag already open, ready to swallow the child like a parcel. Miss Wren saw it from the corridor and shouted. Auntie Sue, delivering buns to the school, dropped her basket and ran. A few older boys followed because chaos is magnetic. Leanne arrived breathless minutes later, hair sticking to her forehead, and she did not scream this time. She pulled out a small tape recorder and announced, in a voice that carried, that she had recorded the previous night's phone call in which Jay threatened to take the girl back whether you agree or not. The crowd's expression shifted from curiosity to unease, because people fear conflict, but they fear documented conflict more. Evidence forces a choice. The village secretary, wary of scandal after the mill theft, told Jay to release the child immediately, and when Jay tried to argue about paternal rights, the secretary answered that rights require responsibility, and responsibility requires a record that Jay did not possess. Leanne filed a petition for protection at the county office with Director Ven's help, and though the paperwork was slow, the act of filing changed the air around her, like placing a boundary stone where none had existed. Interlude: the difficult gift. Micah's relationship with sound was not an instant romance. It was closer to a cautious treaty. The hearing aid amplified not only voices but also the scrape of chairs, the bark of dogs, the clatter of pans, and the constant insect hum that village ears had learned to ignore. And at first, Micah reacted as if the world had begun to shout without warning. She developed headaches that made her press her forehead against the cool wall, and she tore the device off in frustration, then cried because she knew it was precious. Leanne responded with routines. Short listening sessions, quiet walks by the river, gentle games where Micah identified sounds with her eyes closed. And each week the treaty expanded by a few inches. Miss Wren turned language into play. She created a mouth map for Micah, drawing lips and tongues on paper, teaching where vowels live, and she taught the class a handful of signs so that communication could continue on days when sound overwhelmed Micah. A shy girl named Pearl became Micah's first true friend. Pearl would tap Micah's shoulder before speaking so Micah could look, and she would repeat words slowly, smiling instead of mocking when Micah stumbled. Leanne watched the friendship grow and felt a relief so deep it made her dizzy, because it meant Micah's world would not be limited to mother and child isolation forever. Interlude: Leanne's shop of repairs. With Director Ven's introduction, Leanne began repairing small electronics for the clinic and the school radios, blood pressure monitors with loose wires, cassette players used for health announcements because her hands were steady and her mind enjoyed problems that had solutions. She set up a table in the hut with a soldering iron and jars of screws sorted by size, and people who had once dismissed her started to knock on her door with broken things and cautious respect. The income was small but regular, and the regularity mattered. It allowed Leanne to buy batteries for Micah's device without begging, and it allowed her to imagine a future measured in months rather than days. Grandmother Kwan tried once to sabotage this new stability by spreading rumors that Leanne was stealing parts from the clinic, but the accusation backfired, because after Jay's theft, the village was tired of believing Kwan stories. A nurse confronted Grandmother Kwan in the market and said, loudly, that if the old woman spoke again, the clinic would ban the Kwan family from services, and the threat landed because illness does not respect pride. Leanne did not gloat. She simply continued soldering, smoke curling upward in thin blue ribbons like small prayers. Interlude: the court day. The county arranged a mediation hearing to settle child support and custody, not because the system loved Leanne, but because paperwork prefers closure. Jay arrived with a borrowed jacket and rehearsed humility, insisting he deserved weekend visits. And Grandmother Kwan came carrying a stack of papers meant to prove that Leanne was unstable. Leanne brought her notebooks, school reports, clinic receipts, and a sealed envelope of audio tapes authenticated by Director Ven, and when the mediator asked why she had recorded so much, Leanne answered that poor people collect proof the way rich people collect insurance. The mediator listened to excerpts. Grandmother Kwan calling Micah a curse, Jay threatening to take the child, the scrape of a knife at Leanne's latch, and the room's atmosphere changed from abstract dispute to uncomfortable reality. Jay's lawyer tried to argue that recordings could be edited, and Director Ven, calm as a technician, explained chain of custody and timestamps, turning suspicion into mathematics. In the end, the mediator ordered Jay to pay modest support and limited visits supervised by the school. And more importantly, the mediator noted in writing that attempts to remove the child without consent would trigger criminal consequences. Leanne walked out of the building feeling lightheaded, not with victory, but with the rare sensation of a line being drawn on her behalf. Interlude: the seed of the archive. After the hearing, Leanne realized her tapes were more than defense. They were also history. Many village women began to visit her hut with their own stories, speaking softly at first, then more boldly when they realized Leanne did not interrupt or judge. One spoke about a sister forced to abort because her husband's family wanted a son later. Another described a mother-in-law who controlled food as punishment. Another admitted she had once agreed to abandon a baby girl and still woke in sweat decades later. Leanne recorded these voices with permission, labeling each cassette with dates and names, and the archive grew into something that did not belong to pain alone. When the Heritage Room opened months later, Leanne added one new recording to the exhibit. Micah reading aloud a short paragraph she had written herself, describing the river, the canola field, and the day she found her first word. Micah's voice was uneven, sometimes too loud, sometimes swallowed, but it was unmistakably hers, and in the museum's small speaker, it sounded like a future that refused to be bargained away. On the day the Heritage Room opened, School children filed in and put on headphones connected to Leanne's archive. They heard the market's morning din, the river's low roar, the typhoon's wind, and a lullaby Leanne had recorded during the hut's first storm, her voice trembling but stubborn. Micah stood beside the display case where an old naval microphone sat like a relic of a different kind of listening. And when visitors asked what the exhibit was about, Micah said, with a small grin that always arrived half a second late like a tide delayed by distance, "It's about how proof can be soft." Later, when people asked Leanne why she kept the painful tapes instead of burning them, she answered with the calm of someone who had learned to separate memory from captivity. "Because sound is proof," she said. "And proof is how the weak survive the stories the strong try to write." Mika tugged her sleeve and added, tilting her head toward the speakers, as if greeting the world, "And because silence is only peaceful when you choose it." Postscript. The archive did not fix the world, but it gave the world fewer places to hide. When a new village cadre proposed a policy meeting about family harmony, Leanne brought recordings of women's testimonies and asked the cadre to define harmony without hunger, and the room went awkwardly quiet, which was a kind of victory. She taught Mika that justice is rarely a sudden thunderclap. It is more often a sequence of small clicks, like a tape's reel turning one tooth at a time. Years passed with the ordinary drama of growth. Mika learned to swim in the river where Leanne had once imagined their end, and she learned to laugh at jokes she only half caught, because catching half still means the joke reached you. She sometimes removed her hearing aid to rest, choosing silence the way someone chooses shade on a harsh day. And when friends asked if she was sad, she answered that silence could be comfortable when it belonged to her. On the night Mika turned 12, a typhoon skirted the coast and rain hammered the hut's patched roof, sounding almost like applause. Leanne lit a candle, played one of her oldest tapes, and listened to her younger self whisper